Let's go ahead and get started. I really want to respect the time of those of you who are able to make it on the hour. I'm Dwayne Marsh. My pronouns are he and him. I'm the president and CEO of Northern California Grantmakers. Delighted to have you guys with us today. I'm coming to you from the unceded land of the Powhatan Indians in Central Virginia, actually. Just a couple of housekeeping things as we get started. As I mentioned, is in the chat, if you can introduce yourself, your name, your pronouns, organization, and if there's a hope you have for the conversation. As we get underway, really wanting to answer this question of why California state government is so critical as a partner for racial organizing, I'm going to frame things up for a couple of minutes, and I have to confess I have a little bit of organizer's bias. Before joining NCG, I was the co-director of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity that worked very closely with what is now known as CCORE, and you'll hear more about that as a principal trainer and strategist in that work, and so really believe in the work that was done there. But we'll name that California's philanthropic community grants more than $20 billion annually in California, primarily to highly deserving nonprofit organizations. But we recognize the size and scale of those investments in some ways paled in the comparison of what state government can actually do. Consider this: California now home to 40 million people, the largest population in the country, the fifth largest economy in the world. Our upcoming state budget is estimated to be more than $300 billion, including this year about a $95 billion surplus. We'll probably come back to that. There are 16 departments and dozens of associated agencies ranging from house and community development to education to corrections, human resources, statewide training, the leave accounting system, a myriad of organizations within the organization employing more than 237,000 employees with the gross monthly wages of close to $2.5 billion. So these are all things we want to think about as we consider this issue. We know that despite the tremendous wealth in the state, it doesn't reach all of our populations. In May of 2022, there was a poll by the Policy Institute of California, and they found that Californians named inflation, jobs, and the economy as their top issues facing them right now. They also named 1 in 3 saying that rising prices were really causing serious financial challenges and hardship for them, including housing cost and availability, homelessness, gas increase of prices, and of course, issues like drought. We also recognize these issues disproportionately impact communities of color, as is often the case, and this is also worsened during the pandemic. We know we can't do this work alone, and so funders like the California Endowment and California Wellness Foundation, which are with us today, are partnering with Public Health Institute's State of Equity to advance racial equity work within government. It's important work because it advances an inside-outside strategy with state government. We know our investments in power building are necessary to lift up community voice and democratic processes, but we know at the same time we have to work with government employees and train them to build their capacity to be racial equity leaders within government. They can uphold the values and approach government investments in our communities with a racial equity lens. With this public-private partnership to grow and flourish, we need community and government allies working towards an aligned goal. And working hand in hand to achieve racial equity in our communities. The commitment will pay out if we work on the long term and think with vision for that. A couple things to name that we think will pay off if we do this work: increased accountability, this notion that engagement of state government and understanding why they have to prepare and partner with us is critical for that long-term systemic change, and that takes inside and outside strategy. Opportunities to co-govern, and obviously the benefits that creates when people on the ground have agency and say in the work they do. And we have to break away from this cynical form of government and focus on what it could be and how we get there. So the panel today is going to talk a little bit about how to share this example of CCORE and how our grant-making community can work together with government to ensure systems change centers racial equity. I want to introduce our panel, and then we're going to get right underway. Julia Kaplan is the Executive Director of State of Equity. You may have known it as the Health in All Policies program at the Public Health Institute. She and her team have spent more than a decade assisting and organizing California state government to embrace and embed racial equity and health equity across more than 40 units of government, and looking at everything ranging from transportation, land use, education, agricultural, social services. State of Equity also runs the Capital Collaborative on Race and Equity, CCORE, which helps government build capacity and take action to address institutional and structural racism, including developing institutional commitments and plans to change practices related to policies, community engagement, public accountability, workforce budgets, and more. She's joined by Alexandra DeSatels, who joined the California Endowment as program manager for strategy development in 2014 and has since moved on to the role of Senior Program Manager for Power Infrastructure. In this role, she's responsible for working with staff across the foundation to sharpen the core elements of the Building Healthy Communities strategy and the strategy evolving from that. She also manages portfolios relating to building the state's power infrastructure, which includes building narrative power to increasing the strengths of networks and alliances. And then Earl Liu is a program director at the California Wellness Foundation, where he currently manages grant making related to the equity and access portfolio. Prior to joining California Wellness, he was a senior attorney at Consumers Union, West Coast office in San Francisco, focusing on healthcare advocacy. Thank you to all of our guests for being here today, and I'm hoping you're looking forward to a great conversation. If we can get underway, I'm going to actually just throw a couple of questions. We want to go conversation style today, but a few things to frame up the discussion and get things going. If you're in the audience, know that you can chat questions to us along the way, and we're going to collect those and make sure we have at least 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A at the back end of the conversation. So let me start with this. What do you guys see as the greatest opportunities for leveraging and advancing a racial equity agenda in California state government? What's the current potential and leverage? And which of you would like to start?
Alex, do you want to start?
Sorry about that. My computer had frozen for a second. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So nice to be here today. I'm really excited to be part of this panel, sharing some of the ways in which we see the work going on at the Capitol, building the governing racial equity muscle of our state apparatus in California is adding value across the state. Just a little bit more background about me. Before coming into philanthropy, I was working in local government, and I got to see firsthand how I was lucky to work in an organization that had made a commitment to racial justice and was doing some work to figure out how can we actually go from kind of having racial justice as a value to operationalizing it in our day-to-day activities. And I'll say that at the beginning, there were many things that we were doing. And the longer that I was there, the more that I realized that it was many of the day-to-day decisions that were being made that could add up to real impact on the ground. Just to give an example, I was there when realignment happened in the state of California, and there was a moving of resources from the Department of Corrections to probation in the different counties as people were moved from prisons to jails. And when those resources moved, there was a real value then around kind of re-granting those resources into communities. In fact, I think that was part of the legislation. And yet we had a department that had never done contracts with community organizations before. And so that was a real opportunity. And so you have just a contract writer, not someone whose title is Chief Equity Officer, or who understands that they have a mandate as part of their job to advance racial equity. And yet there they are with the capacity to make an incredible impact on how resources are redistributed in a place that either kind of advance our vision for racial justice, both within the government systems, but also in broader community context, or could not just be a missed opportunity, but actually be harmful and further retrench injustices. And so we see that today too. And what I'm really excited about thinking about the national level is at the start of the Biden administration, there was they announced their commitment to Justice 40, which was a commitment to make sure that 40% of all of the benefits from the various different programs that they were moving on related to environmental justice and community sustainability would benefit, quote, disadvantaged communities. And a lot of those resources, so those resources that program includes important departments, federal departments like HUD, AG, EPA, and others that do a lot of their work by re-granting to the states, by devolving down the resources to the states, including the state of California. And so this is very similar to my experience with realignment. We have in our state government, people who are now in charge of thinking through how are we going to make sure that the programs that we are in charge of actually confer a benefit, a financial benefit to the communities that they're purported to serve. And knowing and having been in government, there's a lot of people who are very willing but don't always have either the support within their departments or the skills. And so it's really exciting to know, as these resources are coming in, the work that's happening at the state level to actually create a community of practice amongst the departments that really is oriented towards racial justice, and to create systems of accountability, so that it's not just kind of on the goodwill of the individuals, but actually there are kind of action plans that are released that those departments are accountable for, that really will make sure that the spirit of something like Justice 40, which was a really exciting advancement, and there's been significant resources put into organizations that are working with the federal government agencies to kind of prepare their staff to do racial justice work, is met with a similar level of capacity and commitment in the state of California. So that's one thing that comes to mind, Dwayne.
Appreciate that, and had the opportunity to be in federal government at a time when they were trying to push an equity agenda, and it's so important. Is there a connective tissue to states? Julia, maybe you can say a bit about what that's looking like in California right now.
Yeah, great. And thank you all of you for being here. And as I'm reading through the chat, I'm very excited about getting to be with you and Dwayne and Alex and Earl, and also just everybody that's on the call. And I have to also give a really big thanks to my staff team. So I'm here speaking on our behalf, but there's a whole group of people doing the work, and they are brilliant and driven and super hardworking, and I learn from them every day. And so if you are on the staff team, if you wouldn't mind just turning on your camera and giving a wave, I would like folks to be able to see who you are, and thank you for joining us today. So in my path, I started out actually doing Middle East peace activism and organizing in my youth. And then I became a youth organizer and was doing Books Not Bars work in the San Francisco Bay Area, got involved in reproductive rights, got involved in economic security, organizing and work for seniors. And all of this led me to government and policy. And so it was kind of I wouldn't say it was a windy path, but it was a path that just kept pointing me back to government. And so I feel very fortunate that for 12 years, I've gotten to work with this team and with California state government. And I think, there's a number of things kind of going for us right now. Our state budget is $300 billion. If you think about what would it be like if $300 billion of funds, much of which is going out to communities, was being kind of administered from a racial equity lens in terms of what that money is funding, how it's funding, what organizations are receiving it, how those payments are happening so that it can go to small community-based groups, who's making the decisions. It's just tremendous. And so there's a huge opportunity there. A second piece is that communities are organized. They know what they want, they know what they need, they are telling government, they have been telling government. The barrier here is that government is really woefully unprepared, and we need government to be on its game. We need government to be ready to respond to the will of the people and not harm people while trying. And rather than asking community to train government, to work with community, community isn't the barrier. We need to change how government is interacting and interfacing. So, government is a system. It's not operating the way it should be. And there are amazing, so I'm getting back to the opportunities, amazing people inside government who are really eager and are active and pushing for change. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is a generational shift in government. We're seeing that, just in the last 3 or 4 years in California state government. More and more people are getting appointments or moving up in the ranks of their institutions many of them are coming from community groups and from advocacy organizations, and are coming to government not just to have a paycheck, but really to change government, are coming with a vision of something very different from how it is now. And so we've got these, we like to call them and ourselves bureauactivists, but this incredible growing community of folks. And they're also often isolated. They're, trying to figure out how to get the political will from above them, and they need support around an organizing strategy. So there's just a lot happening right now to capitalize on. And I think that, when we think about our team, State of Equity, we're really a bridge. We're pulling all of these different pieces together, working with government organizations, helping them make changes to center the priorities of the communities that they serve, connecting those individual movers and shakers and folks who really want to make change, setting up structures for them to coordinate, collaborate, organize, hearing from them where they need outside pressure. And then we're also working with advocates and community-based organizations, both to kind of give them a heads up about where government actually needs pressure, where those pressure points are that we're learning about, and also making sure they're aware of opportunities for input that often are not well publicized. So that's a bit of kind of how we operate, but also I just think now, the time is really ripe for this work right now.
A ton of things under the hood and what you just named there, Julian. I want to circle back to some of that, but first I wanted to give Earl a chance to further introduce himself and say a bit about why you feel this is important for philanthropy. What's the leverage that philanthropy can get on government in this moment?
Thanks, Dwayne. It's great to be here today. Well, here's why I think this work matters for philanthropy. So the way I think about it is, let's imagine, like, if we could just do a big do-over in this country, I mean, a really big do-over. Ask yourself, what if government at all levels, federal, state, local, made decisions, implemented laws and policies using a racial lens, prioritizing racial justice from the very beginning? What would society look like now? I think we all know it would look very different than what it looks like now. You could start with schools and schools that are not segregated, communities that aren't segregated, and just let your imagination go from there. So if government had always done this, many of the problems that our foundations are trying to address might not be as serious as they are now, or might not even be present like they are now. But we can't go back in time and have a do-over. So just to name just another example, we can't go back in time and stop freeways from being built, or urban renewal or redevelopment projects from being built that divided and destroyed communities of color. But what we can do now as funders is the next best thing. We can help government do its job better. And I think that's what Alex and Julia have been talking about. Infusing racial equity into government decision-making now will help address a lot of the prior inequities that we're dealing with and prevent new ones from happening. And I think we can all agree that's what we want to do. That's what philanthropy should be helping to do. So no matter what issues your foundation works on, whether it's education, environment, health, criminal justice, economic security, government policies, state policies have a great impact on what you care about. And as Dwayne mentioned in his introduction, we and Julia mentioned, we've all heard the numbers. Government resources dwarf what we have in philanthropy. And as we've heard, implementation of a lot of laws and policies is key here. We're not just talking about passing new laws, but effective and equitable implementation depends on state and local agencies and the people inside them, the people who actually do the work. In the past couple of years since COVID, I've been thinking a lot about the role of foundations in philanthropy and what we ought to be doing. And what I've been thinking about is that, I'm all about leverage these days. And since COVID, a lot of foundations, especially in the health foundations, we're working together more, we're collaborating more, trying to align our funding more, and that's great. That has to continue. But we need to do more. The ultimate form of leverage is leveraging government and its resources and dollars. You can imagine, think of it another way, like what if everyone working in government had the same commitment and understanding as we do about racial justice? A lot of us fund nonprofits to work on policy and advocacy, community organizing, power building. Those are all needed. We should keep doing that. But what if we could make the lives of those grantees easier by also helping at the same time to make government more receptive to racial equity and racial justice in the first place? I think we need to do both. We need both outside and inside strategies to create the better world we want to see.
Thanks, appreciate that, Earl. I was wondering, I know there's some impressions of government that people hold who haven't been in government or work with government. And Julia, I was wondering if you could share a little of the story of the beginnings of this partnership you had in CCORE and the initial outreach, because I think it's kind of revealing what you guys discovered when you started to see, were there people in state government prepared to have this conversation?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And one of the things I was just reflecting on as you asked that is the really critical role of philanthropy in our ability to do this work. And one of the questions that we've gotten a lot from our foundation funders, which is a really important question, is how can we leverage government dollars and get government to pay for capacity building, training, racial equity organizing? And we have been able to do that to some degree. But when we first started, we were really looking for early adopters that were, maybe had the political will to show up for a racial equity program, but they didn't have the support to be able to pull in funds from their budgets, despite their budgets being enormous. Over time, we've seen that really change, and we've seen more and more organizations signing up for this work, more and more leaders being willing to go public around their commitments to racial equity and racial justice, which is signaling kind of top down the green light to all of their staff and programs. And more organizations that have gone through CORE building racial equity into their strategic plans, which then influences their budgets, which allows them to allocate funds. But we've been very dependent on philanthropy in a few ways. One of them is to do things that we're always a step beyond where government is. So when government catches up to us, it's time for us to move forward and move further out. We need to keep pushing and leading. And so government's never going to be fully caught up to us, at least not for a long, long time, till we reach Earl's vision, which I hope happens. The other piece is the philanthropic dollars have allowed us to weather some really big ups and downs in government, like turnover in an administration. Cabinet secretary gets fired, happens all the time. Or there's a new governor or different pieces like that. And we are not having our focus pulled by those things, or natural disasters or COVID. We're able to really keep the focus on this and keep this moving forward. And so that has also been really key. I would love, Dwayne, would this be a good time for me to just show a couple slides with the participating agencies? So. Mm-hmm. Okay, let me see. I'm gonna share my screen, and I have a longer slide deck I'm not going to go through. We will either drop this in the chat, or we will follow up with an email to you all and provide it to you. But I wanted to just show a couple of things. Well, one is actually just the logos. Can you see my screen?
We can.
The logos on here just to show that there are a lot of partners, and these aren't even our government agency partners, but a lot of entities behind this. It really takes a village. And I wanted to say about the reach that we're currently working with over 40 government agencies, departments, commissions, offices, councils. We have, through CORE, trained over 600 people, including our current cohort. We ask them how many of them supervise people. We estimate over 7,000 direct reports from these folks who are getting this kind of training. And of course, training is only one part of what we do. We have an organizing strategy, and training is part of how we reach people, but we're using that to then implement systems and structural changes. You will not be able to probably discern this chart, but we'll send it out as well. But this is the governor's administration's organizational chart of all of the agencies, and the ones that have a color on them are indicating that they have participated in CORE at some point in the last 4 years. And one thing that we've seen also is initially, as I said, we had the early adopters. This cohort that we just launched a couple months ago, we have the Department of Finance, which was not an early adopter and is a really big deal to have them in this. So as conversations are starting to come up, especially from advocates and through the legislature about racial equity and social justice in budgeting, it makes a really big difference that we have the Department of Finance in our cohort right now. These slides just, yeah.
I was just going to say, I will go back to that slide for just a second. For folks who are overwhelmed by this, just note the row of color that is crossed near the middle. Those are key agencies that lead other departments and agencies that CCORE has managed to reach. So the penetration is getting at key levels of state government to have much more influence. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dwayne. And that's right. So, you know, we now have support from cabinet level secretaries and their agencies, and then the departments that they oversee. These are just lists by year of the organizations that participated, and I'm going to flip through it, but we'll get this to you later if you want to see specifically. And then I've got a couple of lists here of just, you know, people always want to know about outcomes, of course, and so much of this is process changes, but we have 33, I think now that number is probably 40 of our participating organizations all have racial equity action teams within their organizations. So if you go back to that org chart, all of these organizations that have a colored square have a racial equity team and structure. They did not have those before CORE started. You know, a number of them have equity liaisons, have established staff teams. The Department of Transportation launched an Office of Equity with 10 positions that they've built into their budget. And then this slide is a list of institutional commitments. And when we share this out, these are all linked so you can click through and see the statements and public commitments that are being made, and then just some reflections from participants, which is always nice to hear what they are saying about the work. I'm going to stop sharing. Yeah.
I appreciate that. I'm going to throw an impossible task at you, Julia, and I'll ask you in 2 to 3 minutes, characterize what we're up against. What are the barriers and challenges to getting to the point where you are now, where this many departments and agencies are engaging in this process? On the other side of this question, yeah, right. On the other side of this question, we're going to talk about what you're starting to see as results, but we don't want to short sell the hard work this is to make change within systems that I would argue are doing exactly what they're set up to do. So,
right.
talk a bit about those challenges.
So I'd like to say a little bit, and then I want to see if particularly Holly or Dalila on my team want to chime in on this as well. But I think there are different levels of barriers. I mean, one of them is we talk about procedural justice and procedural equity. There are so many things baked into our government practices that, you know, whether some of them were set up intentionally to harm people and to give, you know, unequal benefits, and some of them were not, but they have that effect and they're very entrenched and very hard to undo. So we've got all of these agencies that are like, yes, we get it. We want to partner with community much, much more. We're going to get all these funds out the door. We're going to give them to small community-based organizations. We're going to engage them in our work. And then they go to their contracting office and they can't do it. You know, there's all of these limitations, or they're only allowed to give out money after the work is done. And how many small community organizations have enough funds in the bank to go ahead and do a year or two worth of work and then get paid afterwards? So that's one specific example. I think another barrier is accountability, and there is no big overall charge for our state government to be accountable around racial equity. So it's amazing what we've been able to do and they've been able to do on a voluntary basis. And that's incredible. And there's limits to what's going to happen, especially when things get difficult. And then with a lack of accountability, there's not public transparency. That is a big challenge. And then the other is just the need for this is massive. I mean, Dwayne, you shared numbers about how many people and organizations are inside our state government. We are a team of, our whole state of equity team is 7 staff and 2 AmeriCorps volunteers. Our core team is 3 co-leads. And you think about the entirety of state government, you know, we will never be able to meet that need. So how, you know, we're doing the organizing and kind of drumming up demand, but the more that we do that, and advocates are pushing too, so it's not all us by any means, but the demand just far outweighs what we're able to do.
So that's about 81,000 employees per core team member. Is that my math?
That's right. Yeah, Holly or Dalila, do you want to add anything?
Gosh, challenges. No, those were good challenges, Julia. I will say that we on the core team, yeah, we're a small but mighty team. A lot of what we do is making it easiest for state government to say yes to this, because they won't do things that they're not made to do, right? By legislation. And they're not made to do racial equity yet, right? And so they're really doing this on a voluntary basis where people that are early adopters are really personally and professionally drawn to this work because of their experience or other, like are creating together this movement in government, this need in government to move towards racial equity. And so part of our challenge is to really communicate the mission criticalness of this to government, to reiterate that, to state that again, to reiterate that, and to like gather the power and leverage the people and influence who we need to influence to move this thing when they're not made to do it. So I think that's like a really huge thing. And so we bend over backwards to make it easy in the amount of money they're paying us to like do these trainings, or, you know, we're flexible, or to like the number of people on the team, sometimes we're flexible. You know, we spend copious amounts of additional hours supporting with technical assistance and coaching some of these teams, right, to coach them through adaptability and leadership. And so it does take a lot of work and flexibility to do the work. Another thing which is like really interesting to me is government says like, oh, we want to break down silos. We want to break down silos. Yes, let's break down silos. And then because we convene a lot of people and across lots of different units of government, we think, oh, well, they're in the same cohort. They'll automatically then, if they, you know, they'll reach out to one another. That doesn't happen. And so what we're finding is that people ask me, well, what do you do? I say, well, I create space and time for things to happen, for people to come together. And then they question kind of like the value of that, right? Like, that's all you do? You create space and time? And I'm like, well, what do you mean that's all I do? That is a big thing, because what I'm finding is even though that they're in the cohort together, people won't reach out to each other. Departments don't just say like, oh, hey, Department of so-and-so did X thing to advance racial equity. Let's, you know, reach out to them. And so the backbone support, the organizing support is super valuable in this work moving forward. And so that's just another challenge, just kind of the status quo of things, right? It's very, very hard to turn people out of that status quo is what I'm finding.
Holly, you're naming a good pivot for us on what it takes to get to true government transformation. And so I want to open this one up for everyone in the panel to share from your own perspectives. What do we need to see in order to have racial and health equity really be at the heart of public institutions practice? You'll have different observations from your points of view, so any of you can start. Or maybe Julie, you can start.
Sure. You kind of threw me for a loop there. You know, I think what we're trying to do is transform government to make it a willing and committed participant in this effort, this fight for racial justice. And to me, it's part of undoing or unlearning kind of the bad things that government, sort of what I talked about earlier, about how government decisions have led to inequities, racial inequities. And especially, I think these days, kind of looking at what's going on, you know, I don't know how many folks are following the January 6th committee hearings, you know, but this insurrection that we had last year, and just the attack on government and the public sector over the last 40 years by the radical right, that's what I'm thinking about, that we can't survive long in this country if democracy and the public sector and government is always under attack. And I think part of our job as funders is to kind of repair or undo that damage to government, to kind of make government more effective at doing the job that it's supposed to do, that we want it to do. And so as a funder, I'd like to kind of just shift our mindset from just thinking about, sitting around in our offices thinking about what we can do with our grant making budgets, but really think about how can we someday put ourselves out of business by transforming government, making it more effective, and doing the job it's supposed to do by addressing the inequities that we all see.
Appreciate that. I mean, kind of what you're naming is what we talked about earlier, of this notion of co-governance and how community can really have some agency in this work. And so, Alex or Julia, any observations you have on the steps that we need to get there? Alex, we can't hear you actually, I think. There, try again.
Did it work this time?
It did, thank you.
Sorry, my computer keeps freezing for some reason. I apologize for that. The California Endowment, we have a strong emphasis on building power and specifically on community organizing. And a lot of what we're hearing from our partners is about the need to really think about governing power. And I'll say that my understanding of what that means is still in development. But from what I understand, it's, we've been able to support greater kind of elected officials who hold values around racial justice coming into office. And we have a sophisticated and growing group of organizing partners on the ground who are really creating more opportunities for community leadership in determining how we solve the problems that are driving the root causes of racial injustices. And at the edge of that work is really how do we bring together this growing community power with this kind of more and more people holding elective office to wield it in a way that consistently moves the needle towards racial justice. And I think that there is a lot for us to learn about kind of not just the kind of policy-making side of that, but the administrative policy-making side of that, where, once the kind of big commitments are made, how does it roll out and who's in charge of it? And how do we collaborate continuously with across that, like inside outside, as Earl was saying, to get programs rolled out in a way that actually advances racial justice. And a couple of the things that I know from my experience in government would have been helpful is developing the fortitude to hear criticism and take it in and not get defensive and maintain trust in partnerships to move forward. I know that there's often a feeling inside of government of like, but we're trying and it's so hard and there's so much we're up against. And I do think that fortitude and some of what Holly was describing around creating a sense of community and ability to kind of receive information and stick with it and continue building trust and try harder and do better is a muscle that's really underdeveloped and is something that I know that in addition to the kind of head part of the work that is going on, there's the kind of heart and community building part of it too. And when we think about, I think it's like over 200,000 people in the state of California government. That's a lot of people whose jobs can be impacted by this work. The other part of it that I think is really exciting is creating more opportunities for interface. And so I know that there's like now an advisory council where we have some of the leaders who are working in nonprofits that many of the people here fund, kind of directly guiding state agencies on how do we interpret this. I think there was a question in the chat, are people kind of understanding the jargon similarly? And it's like, there's both the similar in terms of how different state agencies understand and kind of get trained on some of these concepts and how to apply them. And then there's the testing and real-time feedback. And like, here's what we're struggling with people who are not in government, who can provide some of the grounding that when you are working inside of government, you lose, just like you do when you're in philanthropy. So those are some of the things that are kind of coming up for me, Dwayne, in response to your question.
I appreciate that. We're going to pivot to those Q&As in just a moment, but I did promise sharing some success stories. And so, Julia, as you think about this, I've witnessed some of that, but what are a few examples you might lift up for folks in the audience that show you guys are on the right path?
I'll give actually one success story that's been over the whole 12 years is when we first started doing our work, which previously was called Health in All Policies and has evolved from health to health equity to racial equity and health equity together. But we were trying to work with transportation, and initially, the attitude that we got from that institution and the people there was like, "Who are you? What do you want? Why do you want to talk to us? Stay in your lane. We don't do health. You don't do transportation. We're all good." And over time, we found a couple people there who were willing to talk to us, who educated us about their field. We started building relationships. We formed a group with them. Various things happened. And then advocates from the outside pushed on legislation that required the Department of Transportation to incorporate health equity into their work. And we were there when they were like, "We just had this pass and we don't know what to do. Will you help us?" And we had already kind of established ourselves as a trusted partner and entity. And so, flash forward, because there's many more pieces to the story, but Caltrans was part of our first cohort. They updated their strategic plan to have health and equity incorporated. They and their sister transportation departments and agencies have made some very bold statements conveying an understanding of the historical legacy of institutional and structural racism and white supremacy in transportation policy. And we have seen differences now in who they are appointing as their key leaders, their department director, their cabinet secretaries, and really bringing people in who have a strong equity and racial equity lens. So that is an example. Yeah, there's one. There's many.
Excellent. Others may come up in the Q&A, and there were two parts of the question that Alex started to answer. Part of the question was, are departments and agencies receiving the same training? I want to tweak that a little bit. How have you had to adjust or evolve this training over the last 5 or 6 years to continue to move the state government in this direction?
Yeah, we have definitely evolved it over the last several years. Initially we started with the training that was developed by the Government Alliance on Race and Equity that was really customized for city and county governments. And so there's been a lot of work to integrate state government perspectives and understanding and kind of policy issues and barriers. Another piece that has been really interesting about our cohorts is all of the organizations in it are part of the same government system. So there are opportunities through that to identify issues where they're each hitting up on the same problem and they might think it's their own problem. But when we get them together in a peer-to-peer learning environment, we figure out, no, this is a systemic issue. And which, then kind of that's where some of our organizing work comes in, of figuring out who else in government or the governor's office or elsewhere can we pull in to help strategize with those. I think that there's some very California specific policy pieces, like we have an anti-affirmative action law that comes up all the time, and we bring in folks specifically who understand that in California and can advise on. There's a lot of racial equity work that can happen despite that law. And then the other piece I just wanted to share around this is that I think is really important. So I know that a number of you are from outside of California and have a national perspective from your funding work, or all of us have a national perspective in our interests. And we are the first state government to have this level of racial equity organizing across a state government entity. Others have done this, one or agency at a time, but none others right now have this kind of cohort model. And so we are partnering with Race Forward and the Government Alliance on Race and Equity to start to identify people in other states who are leading in racial equity, and there are quite a few. We now have relationships with, I think, folks in about 12 states, and are beginning to build a community of practitioners. And in the process of doing that work, one of the things we're looking forward to doing is figuring out what from our work can be useful for folks in other states, and recognizing that every state's going to be very different. So, you know, we're excited to be kind of bringing that to the national scene as well.
So the 81,000 employees that you each have now will expand that number per. You guys need some more support to do this work.
California has more employees than the other states, but yes. Yes.
Well, there's a great and somewhat sophisticated question in the queue, and I want to break it into parts, if I may. And I think each of you might have a different take on it. So the first part of the question is really acknowledging what a sophisticated power building ecosystem California has. So part A is, what should funders think about the additional investments that need to be made in that ecosystem and other critical partners so that racial equity, governing for racial equity, can become an outcome? So let's just start with that piece, and we'll take the second piece after you reflect on that for a moment. And I'm betting our funders will have a different take on what that investment should look like than our nonprofit partner.
Well, I can say a few things off the top of my head around this. I mean, yes, of course, I'd like to say fund us. And I think that there are a lot of really important places to put resources. And ultimately, as Earl and Alex and all three of you, all of us have made the point, the goal is to leverage the billions of dollars that are going out from government. And so where can we invest smaller amounts of money that, you know, kind of using a lever effect can lead to much bigger shifts in resources? So one piece of that is, whether it's us or others, but intermediary organizations that are working on the inside of government to do this transformational work, and also working very closely with community. And I think that we kind of fall into this group that is often invisible. In fact, a lot of times we have our work go under the radar intentionally, because of the sensitivities of the politics of where we're working. But I think those intermediary roles are really key. And my hope as we do this work nationally is that we will be able to identify intermediary organizations in other states as well, and localities that can really be taking this on there. And then also I would say community. I mean, just the community groups that are involved in this work are, I'm just continually blown away by the really sophisticated analysis and understanding and perspectives and input, and how hard they are fighting to get these doors open. But what they have to offer is tremendous.
Yeah, I guess I would add to that. I think it's funny sometimes because, you know, when I almost kind of wanted to say, put a +1 in the chat if your foundation has a consultant helping you with racial equity work right now, which I think, you know, kind of would be equivalent to what you're talking about in terms of intermediaries. But I realize I should probably say, put a +1 if you don't, because I'm sure most organizations here have someone on contract. And so I think that what Julia is bringing up in the kind of capacity building, we know in philanthropy firsthand how that outside support is really critical to thinking about our own internal systems changes. Some of the other things that when I've started, and this is just, like I said previously, really a learning edge for me around governing power and learning from our of grantee partners about what this means and what this looks like and what are the capacities that are being built. Is really thinking about, like, what does it take? What is the kind of governance that we want? What, you know, where are we now, and what is the kind of new governing paradigm that we're looking for, and what are the capacities that that people need, both those who are employed in government right now, as well as all of us as, you know, people who are who have to do their part to kind of be civically engaged and make this this state what it is and realize the vision that we have of racial equity. And so I think of some of the groups that are doing things like, on the grant side, we think about more trust-based philanthropy and more participatory philanthropy. There's those who are thinking about this with government. So like the Participatory Budgeting Project, and groups that are trying to think about like, how do we strengthen that governing muscle? And then I also think about the ways that we support the people who are in positions of governing, either elected or otherwise, to be in accountable relationship with the community groups on the ground. And so, like I mentioned previously, I know that there's been work in, that's easier said than done at the state level. It's like, we think county government or city government is invisible. The state level is completely invisible. And yet there are ways that we can be creating those opportunities for direct kind of engagement and accountability, and the ability to kind of in process govern together. And so, and that requires funding groups in ways that are not just about driving towards a campaign result or a programmatic result, but really to do that kind of relational work that I think that Holly was talking about, and others. And so those are some of the things that come up for me in terms of like, what are the kind of critical partners and kind of capacities in the ecosystem that I think are still in development. And then I think very specifically about like, how could we, when you say, Liz, around the like midterm and short-term investments, I do really think that these opportunities around related to the Justice 40 and how we can look at whether or not we are delivering on that in the state of California is a good opportunity for us to be assessing, is there progress towards some of the racial equity goals that are being set at the federal level, and that should follow those resources on down to the state level. And if not, why not? And what are some of the barriers and capacities that are still weak and need to be built?
Alex, you referenced the city and county action. I know that at one point, more than 30 counties around the state had engaged in similar training around racial equity work. And so, Julia, just wondering, how is that going in terms of building momentum or making the connection between state governments that are active in this and local and county governments?
Well, I think if we had more resources, like one of the things that we would do is put more of our time into those connections. They have been very important for us. And in fact, we got this launched at the state level in part because we pointed out to state government that there were already over 30 local jurisdictions in California doing this kind of racial justice organizing, and nothing was happening in state government. And so, and it's been really important when state government has public hearings or presentations about their racial equity work, that sometimes some of those local jurisdiction leaders show up and talk about what they're doing locally and say, it makes a difference to us when you do this at the state. It sends a signal, it affects the funding that's coming down. There's so many ways and reasons. So that's been really important to understand and also to have communicated.
It just reminded me of how we were doing this work at the local level, and two of the state agencies chose to be the tangerines in a room full of oranges back in 2017. Housing Community Development, one of those agencies, sitting with local counties going through this experience, and they were able to be ambassadors to other state agencies and say, this was relevant for us, even when it wasn't fine-tuned for us. We should take a look at this. And I think really kind of rolled from there. So there are quiet heroes and sheroes in all of this work. As we go forward. I think we've answered all the questions that were there. I want to note that as an organization, we're trying to really reinforce opportunities to move these kinds of conversations. And so we're going to do some follow-up. We'll make sure that you guys get the deck that came from this presentation. We'll just do a little bit of surveying to see what your interest level may be, and let us know directly if you want to engage further with this work in the weeks and months to come. This is a priority effort, and our goal is to see California governed with racial equity. And we know that racial equity nor democracy can survive without each other in mutual support in tandem. So appreciate your interest in being here today. Want to thank our panelists and guests. and enjoying the chat and thanking everybody for a great conversation, and look for more from us in the weeks and months to come.